I'm like, wow.
I know, I am too.
Different
This is
things.
why Kyle is managing this side of things. I'm literally home.
Where is everyone, by the way? I'm in Montreal. You two are in Calgary?
I'm currently in Calgary, but I live in Victoria. I'm just visiting family right now, so I happen to be in Calgary for this.
Oh, neat. And Sarah, where are you at?
All right. I think we're going.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ritual, a live panel discussion and launch of Filling Station Magazine's 74th issue. This is my first time doing a live event like this, so please excuse any technical difficulties that may arise. That being said, hopefully everything goes smoothly, and this is going to be a lot of fun. Filling Station's 74th issue is a special issue on the topic of ritual in experimental writing. We're really excited about it. The issue just came back from the printer the other day. It's beautiful. We're very excited to get it in your hands. My name is Kyle Flemmer, and I'm live here at Shelf Life Books, which is Calgary's bookstore for avid readers and the unusually bookish in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. Shelf Life Books is currently open for browsing by appointment, online orders, curbside pickup, and home delivery, and will be reopening to the public on July 1st. In the meantime, you can check out shelflifebooks.ca for our most current opening hours. In addition to coordinating events for Shelf Life, I'm also the current managing editor of Filling Station, a literary and arts magazine publishing innovative poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, and visual art. As I mentioned, issue 74 takes a special look at the use of ritual in experimental writing, and I am joined today by my co-editor for the issue, Amy LeBlanc, who also happens to be Filling Station's next managing editor. Hello, Amy.
Hello, Kyle.
Thank you for hosting this with me. You are much more of an expert in this area than I am, and so I'm very pleased to have you on board here. Something is scrambled with our videos here, so I'm just going to bring up me and our panelists. We also have 3 excellent panelists, and yeah, it just looks like Amy and Jessica have swapped. So I'm going to go over here and bring up Amy. Sorry about that, guys. Anyways, let me introduce Amy to you. Amy LeBlanc is an MA student in English Literature and Creative Writing at the University of Calgary, and she is the current nonfiction editor at Filling Station. Amy's debut poetry collection, I Know Something You Don't Know, was published with Gordon Hill Press in March of 2020. I have a copy here. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous book. I highly recommend it. Amy's novella Unlocking will be published by the UCalgary Press in their Brave and Brilliant series in 2021. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Room, Prism International, and the Literary Review of Canada, among others. And she is also the recipient of the 2020 Lieutenant Governor of Alberta Emerging Artist Award. Quite a list of accomplishments, Amy. Before we meet our panelists, I'm hoping that Amy can tell us a little bit about ritual. Amy's work touches on ritualistic subject matter, often through the lens of folklore, and I figure she'd be the perfect person to co-edit this issue and to moderate our panel. And let's see here. What do I want to ask you? I want to ask you, Amy, what is ritual? Or I guess more specifically, what came to mind for you when we settled on ritual as the topic?
Hey, first off, thank you for the lovely introduction. So I've been really excited about this issue and really excited about the topic of rituals ever since we decided to do it. We decided late 2019, probably November, October, that we wanted to do this. And what I was so excited about from the beginning was the idea that rituals as a topic and as a theme for a call for submissions is so broad. But I also knew that on the flip side, we would get really incredibly specific and personal submissions that were really specific to the author. And we'd end up with this really neat sampling of different rituals and different perceptions of rituals. So I don't know, like Kyle's right, like a lot of my work touches on ritual and I'm really fascinated by it. I think because there's so many lines that it crosses, like brushing your teeth is a ritual, but so is scattering the ashes of a loved one. There's like holidays and handshakes and birthdays and heirlooms. These are all rituals that we engage with, even if we don't call them as such. And there's a quote from our panelist Jessica at the beginning of her essay that accompanies her artwork that I loved. She says, "Rituals are mysterious acts. In performing them, we invoke the hidden, what lies just beneath the scene." And when I read that, that kind of encapsulated everything for me that I wanted this issue to be, because it's really intensely personal, rituals. So I'm really excited to get the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight about them. What first came to mind for me was definitely like death rituals and mourning rituals, just because culture to culture, they're so different. And we came up with the theme and we accepted all of our submissions before COVID happened, but COVID has kind of thrown all of our personal rituals for a bit of a loop. And I know for myself, I've started engaging in some different rituals and walking a lot more, and listening to a lot more podcasts. And I think I'm sitting in silence a lot more than I did pre-COVID. So yeah, I guess bottom line, I'm really excited to speak with the three of you tonight about your wonderful work in this issue and with your thoughts on ritual in general. Yeah, so thank you for joining us. Yeah, very excited.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think considering the range of material we got in response to the call for submissions for this issue, I'd say that rituals are about as deeply personal and unique as each person who engages with them. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our three panelists, each of whom have work in our new issue. So joining us today from across the country are poet Leslie Joy Ahenda, interdisciplinary artist Jessica Bebenek, and creative nonfiction author S.K. Ibra. We'll do a round of introductions for each of them, and we'll read a bio, and maybe you can give us a quick overview of your project in the ritual issue. After the intros, I'll turn you three over to Amy, and she'll moderate the panel. I know she's got lots of questions. Okay, let's begin with Leslie. Let me see if I have the right camera here. Nope. Huzzah. We're all scrambled name tags now, but that's all right. Anyways, this is Leslie. Leslie Joy Ahenda is a queer Black poet living and working on unceded Lekwungen and Wasanich territory. Educated at the University of Victoria, she was an editorial intern for the Malahat Review. She is currently an assistant editor for Augur magazine, and she will begin an MFA at the University of Guelph in fall 2020. In October 2019, she attended the Emerging Writers Intensive with Canisia Lebrun at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Her work has appeared in CV2, Filling Station, Plenitude, and more. Leslie, three of your poems appear in this issue. Litany on the Hangman, A Bloodless Liminal Amber, and Something Has Tried to Kill Me, which is formally quite unlike the first two. Can you tell us in broad strokes what you're up to with these poems?
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Kyle. It's such an honor to be here on this panel with all of you. The poems that I submitted to Filling Station for this issue were all centered around the idea of how to heal. I've been really interested in the idea of both personal and community trauma and the ways that we walk through those both individually and as groups. So Litany on the Hangman is a very individualistic piece, walking through an instance of violence and trying to learn how to recover. And it uses quite coded and ambiguous language. It wasn't something that I wanted to just talk about head on. I was looking for ways that, how do people use language as a method itself of healing? It wasn't just what am I talking about that is a healing process, but the actual act of writing and finding words, finding language that can bring some sort of solace or some kind of peace, or even put up walls. Because I think sometimes the most healing things can be putting up barriers between the things that cause the trauma. So Litany on the Hangman also, I had a lot of fun with this piece, using the idea of litany as a form, which a litany is a sort of religious text, and it's not a religious piece, but I was really interested in the idea of the way that institutions or groups, any kind of gathering, can use set texts to connect. And that's also something I'll come back to when I talk about the third poem. But first, A Bloodless Liminal Amber is sort of the bridge between the two, because I'm getting into talking about community, but I'm using the same sort of devices with language. Then we get into Something Has Tried to Kill Me, which is a cento. It's a form that I never really used much when I was starting out, because I thought it wasn't necessarily, I don't know, I had some sort of bias against form when I was starting out. But then as I was working on this sort of extended project, thinking about healing, I was looking into form, like I did with the Litany, again with the cento, pulling different lines from different Black artists, anywhere from Beyonce, Kendrick Lamar, to Kinesia Lubrin, Shane Book, different poets. I built this poem out of lines from Black writers to gather, I guess, a text that would make me feel a connection to a community.
Wow. All of the work is quite beautiful and quite powerful. I was particularly blown away by Something Has Tried to Kill Me, which is obviously very well researched, and it's just an amazing work. So thank you for giving us a rundown on that stuff.
Thank you.
Let's see. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Jessica Bebenek. Jessica is a writer and interdisciplinary artist, risograph printer, and bookmaker at Concordia University's Center for Expanded Poetics, which is super cool, by the way. If you're ever in Montreal, you need to stop by the CEP if you're at all interested in experimental poetics. At the center in 2017, Jessica organized the International Occult Poetics Symposium. Her writing has been translated and published internationally, and she has twice been nominated for the Pushcart Prize. She is currently completing her first full-length collection of poetry, No One Knows Us There, and is at work on a non-fiction collection, Writing for Men. You can connect with Jessica at www.jessicabebenek.art and at Not Your Muse on social media. Jessica.
Hello.
Hello. For the issue, you prepared our project lab, and you told us about your embodied interpretation of T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. For those who don't know, our project lab series lets readers behind the scenes on particularly interesting art or writing projects. So Jessica, can you tell us, what have you done to The Wasteland?
Just thoroughly fucked with it. So this was back when I was doing my master's at Concordia. It was sort of my master's project, where I took The Wasteland and I turned it into a knitted scarf, but like intentionally like a really bad shitty scarf full of holes and made of twine. And so what I did to make it was, in, I think it was 25 hours of performances, public performances, I knitted it by turning the stressed beats in the poem into knit stitches and the unstressed beats into purl stitches. And so in the issue, there are pictures of me performing specifically at Nuit Blanche, because that was the first performance. Also, as someone who had never been like an artist before, I was like mainly a writer. And then like, what do you mean you're gonna let me perform for 12 hours at Nuit Blanche in Toronto? Like, I've never done this. But it was pointed out to me afterwards that I had basically set up this like spell-like ritual environment, because I had a little, it's a freight elevator is one of the spots that they give people to perform in 401 Richmond. And I wanted to make it look like, to evoke my specific history of craft, which is most of my ancestors are from England. And so I had like a Victorian drawing room. So I had like a brocade fabric on the walls. And then I laid down a circle of lace on the ground. It's like a tablecloth. And then I had piles of anthologies and flameless candles all around me, trying to invoke like someone, a woman, or not necessarily a woman, but at that time a woman, like working long into the night. And I was, sat there for 12 hours straight knitting. And then someone pointed it to me after. They're like, it looks like you look like a witch. I'm like, well, I am, but like accidentally creating that ritual space. And I think it was a way to make myself comfortable too, right? To be sitting in the middle of a circle when there's like 30 people at a time looking at you. It feels a lot more protected. But yeah, so I wrote about ritual for the issue, specifically, like Amy said, the way that ritual can uncover what is just below the surface. Because I've worked, I have a witchcraft practice for about 4 years now, but before that I did and still do yoga, and Zen Buddhism was sort of the first thing I came to. And so being in trance states like comes naturally for me from practice. And so that's what I was thinking of when I was writing that piece, right? Like you can just dip down into this area that somehow reveals the truth. And then with things like right now, I was rereading my piece and thinking about everything that's going on after the death of George Floyd and race riots and white people really being called to do that work of dismantling their own white supremacist ideologies. I was thinking about like that, how did I not see so many things that are right there, right? They're right there on the surface, and yet I was so blind to them. So I think after COVID, and then after, this ongoing movement around white supremacy or ending white supremacy, so many things have changed that I think the pieces that everyone's written have great resonance now, even more so.
I agree. And one of the things that really draws me to your work, particularly the Wasteland, is how there is so much behind what it appears to be. And I really appreciate you giving us a window into that through the Project Lab, and again here with the panel. All right, we have a third panelist I would like to introduce you to. We also have S.K. Ibra, also known as Sarah Ibrahim. Sarah has lived and breathed stories all her life. The love of a good story made her an obsessive reader and later an obsessive writer. Besides being obsessed with stories, Sarah has an active and adventurous spirit and has done everything from learn martial arts and test ride roller coasters, wow, that's pretty brave, to ride rafts across a lake halfway around the world. Sarah spends her free time drawing and finding stories to experience. She lives in Toronto and hopes to one day walk every road in the city and commit it to memory. Sarah's creative nonfiction piece in the issue is called Mnemonics, Magic, and Memoir, and appears under her pen name S.K. Ibra. In it, we learn about lifting curses, invisibility spells, and a tincture for trauma. Sarah, what do you tell us about ritual and memoir in your piece?
I don't know if I tell. I so much as share like my own experiences. Well, I'll give you context about what made me write this story. I'm in a creative writing program at Sheridan College. It's a creative writing and publishing program, which is really unique for an undergrad program. And we have a course called Two Genres that you take in like third year. And in that class, we take two genres of writing. So like poetry and fiction, or poetry and nonfiction, or whatever combination, drama and nonfiction, and kind of combine those two genres of writing, and then kind of explore what story or your experiences that you sort of want to share. So when I originally started writing this piece, we were only supposed to do, I think, 30 pages, and I ended up writing 60 pages on the first try. And then I ended up doubling the word count per professor, and I just wrote so much. And I had decided to do fiction and nonfiction because I thought that would be an interesting kind of blend of, because I really love fantasy stories and magic and that sort of thing. And I thought, oh, I can do fiction and nonfiction. But as I was writing it, I realized that some of my experiences as a biracial, like my dad's Arab, my mom's Black, as a person with a learning disability, and just a lot of certain things that in society, it doesn't necessarily get voiced. And when I do voice, or people like me voice things, sometimes our experiences are discounted. And as I was writing it, I realized that maybe writing it with fiction and nonfiction together would kind of discount my own story unintentionally. So I started writing little snippets of like poetic interludes that were just pure nonfiction and poetry. And I wrote several of them, and I selected a few that most fit the magical ritual kind of theme that the magazine was having, and put them together. And in those pieces, I talk about like, it's kind of a weird experimental piece where it's poetic, where I talk about the ritual of creating a memory palace and walking. And so for those of you who don't know what a memory palace is, it's a mnemonic device. And it's a device it's really close to me, because the kind of learning disability I have concerns my working memory. So I have trouble memorizing or remembering long pieces of information, and memory palaces are supposed to help you remember those things. And to build a memory palace, you have to imagine a place you're really familiar with, and then just walk down a street or your classroom, or what I use normally is my apartment. I will, like, where the furniture is, I'll replace it with the thing I need to remember, and then put them in order, and then kind of walk in my head through my apartment to remember things. And you kind of have to meditate to get that, or at least for me, you have to kind of meditate and to remember and get to that place of where you can remember, because as soon as you change something in your living room, it's different from your memory palace. So my memory palace is actually like 10 years old. So my apartment, what it looked like 10 years ago versus right now. So so like in my mind, I had like, my mom is a plant lady, and she had like vines across the living room ceiling. So in my memory palace, we still have those vines, and we still have, like, we have certain things that we haven't had in years. And I'm just like, oh, I should probably update my memory palace. But yeah, so that's really strong in how I decided to write this piece. And I tried to do the opposite of what a memory palace is supposed to do. So where you're trying to remember things that you feel is important, you feel like you're going to forget. I decided to explore things that I probably never will forget because of trauma, or a lot of it is trauma, actually. Whether like how teachers deal with me, how my own interactions with police officers growing up, because I grew up in a bad neighborhood, and those sort of things, and how that experience stays with you, and how you can sort of deal with it and experience it in a way that's not where you're in control rather than it's in control of you. So yeah.
Wow. I didn't realize it had come from such a large body of work, and that you had whittled it down for us, but there's such a wonderful consistency to each of the parts. So thank you. Well, now that we all know each other a little bit better now, I think I might turn you over to Amy. She has an incredibly long list of very detailed and complex questions for you. So, Amy, you have the floor.
Okay. So first off, thank you again. It's amazing to hear more about your creative practices. And I had read all these pieces, but it's so much more interesting to talk to you about them and to kind of figure out where they're actually coming from on a deeper level. So the first question that I want to ask the three of you, and it's a very simple one, you can answer this however you want, but what rituals do you engage with on a daily basis?
I guess I'll start. I don't know that I have many that are conscious. I think that if I were to take a look at my day-to-day life for a week, I'm sure I would find many things that I do consistently. But when I think about ritual, I think more about a feeling than necessarily an action or a process. So to me, something like making music, or sitting down to write a poem, or going for a walk, anything that sort of engages things that are sensory, even having a cup of tea. I think that those are the things I do that feel more like ritual, because they engage with physical sensation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I think how you just described it there is so perfect, that because yeah, the way it is so rooted in physical sensation, because I don't always do it. I wish I did it more often, but I have nightly ritual of coming to my altar, because I'm practicing witch, and so I have an altar, and it's a place I go to sit and meditate or do any spellcraft if I am doing spellcraft, and it's always so much better to have a better sleep, and I'm just more grounded if I actually do that each night. But also I've been trying to in the mornings write, sometime between when I wake up and noon, and just make sure I get my writing in first thing in the morning if I can. And both of those things, just like you would drop into a trance, or I would drop into a trance at night, there's a way of like doing that, sitting in my chair, having my coffee, working on my writing, that allows me to like dip into that creative space in the mornings too, right? And it becomes so embedded in your body when you do it over and over again, that you can slip into those things like much better than you could, I can slip into meditation so much better than I could 10 years ago when I first started. So yeah, it's a really good point, that ritual is so physical, and certainly in witchcraft, dancing naked by the fire and all that.
Okay, Sarah, do you have any thoughts?
For me, it depends what I'm doing that day. Because COVID-19 has kind of changed everything. So all the things that I had as a ritual before the whole pandemic started has completely shifted. Like before the pandemic, I'm really busy. So I usually I rush off to work and then school, and then I still have to have time to write and do like other creative stuff, or as right before the pandemic started, I had like an online internship. So like I'm always really busy. So the rituals I do um, would be mostly because I used to do a lot of martial arts and yoga, and a lot, like when you get ready for a competition or if you're really anxious, there's like deep breathing that you do, and that was something that I like, that was a ritual that I would do on the bus, instead of like, because I used to try to be productive all the time, and I said no, there are moments where you need to like center yourself and um, um, be closer to uh, your own emotions and like feel, because I feel like the best way to write is to access your own emotions and then empathize with other people, and it's kind of hard when you're busy and always thinking about the next thing to do. So what I would do, like on the hour and a half bus ride from work to school, I would sit on the bus, close my eyes, sometimes listen to music. It wasn't necessary, it depends on my mood that day, but I would take breaths and sort of think things through, and like I think of the future, think of the present, think of the past, and kind of not necessarily do a memory palace, because memory palaces for me work best when I'm walking or imagine I'm walking, and unless I want it to be in the moment. And usually I use that on transportation, but now that I don't use transportation, I sort of have let that meditation moment go a little. I sometimes do it before bed or in the morning, but I haven't gotten a rhythm yet. So it, for now, no regular rituals. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting though, because I relate to that with taking transit. And that I didn't realize how much of my thinking and processing, kind of mulling the day over time, happened on transit, like on the way to school or something. And now that I don't have that, I don't know that I'm processing it as much. So I don't know, that's been one of those COVID shifts that I never thought I would really miss taking the bus, but I do.
Yeah.
I miss sitting and listening to a podcast. Okay, thank you for your answers. So my next question, is ritual something, and we've talked about this a little bit already, but is ritual something that regularly intersects with your creative practice? Or is it something that you experimented with a bit more specifically in response to the call for submissions? And maybe Jessica, we'll start with you because your work is so ritual based to start with.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this earlier today too. It's funny because at the time that I did that first performance of The Wasteland, which is the first 12 of 25 hours, like I said, I didn't think of it as casting a spell like I now do. Like someone called it banishing the modernist daddies, a spell to banish the modernist daddies. Yeah, I didn't, at the time, I remember thinking that there were streams that ran alongside each other, like magic in the world and the logic of dreams and the logic of poetry, were like these different these different separate things that operated in the same way and therefore like didn't need to intersect, like they were whole in themselves. And now I see it, I agree, like I still think that they have a similar logic, right? Like dream logic is the same as poetry logic, where you can make these associative jumps. But now I see so much more, and it really clicked when I was at a talk by Leanne Simpson, and she said that she's an Anishinaabe, and she said that she thinks back to the time like before colonization when her people, her ancestors would be creating their world every day, like physically making things, right? Like you can't go and buy a meal or something, like you're really creating your world every single day in every way. And that really stuck with me. And the act of creation, seeing the act of creation, whether it's like making a meal or whether it's creating art, seeing that as a spiritual act and seeing it as an act of worship as well. That also comes from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's also an Indigenous writer, thinker. Just want to credit all these people who gave me these amazing ideas. Yeah, just seeing creation as an act of worship really allowed me to see that in my own practice, yeah, in my own artistic practice. So that's something that's still like opening up for me.
Yeah, and I have to imagine too that it's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And I just know from my own writing as well, it's not something where you're ever like, well, I've arrived, I understand this now. It's going to be learning and unlearning throughout our entire creative lives. And like you said, ideally every day of just sitting down and creating the world that you want every day, and the world.
Especially.
Yes.
Like
exactly.
The act of rewriting The Wasteland was very much an act of rewriting or like unmaking these kinds of like this canon that I just didn't want to be a part of. That when I was in my undergrad, I was like, oh, this is, you know, this is what it is, and this is what you need to be like if you're going to be a good writer. And just I've had to like tear it down for myself.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. Yeah, just with the canon as well of like there's a giant process of unlearning the canon. As someone who did an English Lit degree and is doing another one, the canon doesn't let go easily. It's just kind of a constant struggle to try and pick it apart and keep reading other writers that aren't canonized, because frankly, a lot of the time they're so much more interesting. Okay, thank you, Jessica. Does anybody else have any thoughts you'd like to add on this one?
With what you said, Jessica, about writing as an act of worship really interested me, because I think I do something similar in that, especially with the center that I wrote, was maybe an act of sharing or an act of coming home, which I think kind of feels like it could have a similar energy to it. And this idea of unlearning the canon and coming back into something, or back into voices that have been marginalized or haven't been cemented as important, you know, asking the questions of who gets to be important. And Amy, I think I forget what your actual question was, so I hope I'm answering it. But I'm reminded most days, especially in the last couple of weeks, of a poem by Jericho Brown called Bullet Points. And the first 4 lines, the whole poem is about how the speaker is trying to express the fact that if they are ever found dead, they've been killed by police. And this idea that so many Black people's deaths are considered suicides or ruled suicides by authorities when really they've been killed by authorities. And the first 4 lines are, I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And then it goes on. But what interests me is the way that the lines are broken, where each line ends with the line, I will not shoot myself, I will not shoot myself, and then it breaks to the next thing. But this hammering repetition of I will not, and then moving on into the rest of the poem, but that sort of hard-handed line break feels like that's one of the things that really inspires me to think about language and the way that how we place language on the page becomes its own form of communication. And so I think that particularly with the kind of repetition that he's doing there, I think repetition and ritual are very tied. So the way that we construct language and the way that I'm trying to construct language now is calling to all these ancestors or contemporaries, people who have been writing without being recognized until very recently, and saying, how are they doing this and what kind of rituals are they using that I can learn from?
Yeah, that's so interesting too, what you said, Leslie, because I'm just thinking about Vivek Shaya's collection, Even This Page is White, and like the decolonizing of white space, and how that's something as white poets we just don't think about. The page is what it is. And then you get other writers that come in and say, well, maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And maybe this is a colonial construct, and maybe there's another way to kind of parse this out. So I really, yeah, no, that's so interesting. Yeah, I love that. Okay, thank you for your comments. Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Yes. I really like, Leslie, what you were saying about ancestors and that repetition of voice. So my mom is Ethiopian, and in her mother tongue of Amharic, there's a certain way of talking. Her actual mother tongue is Gurage, but Ethiopia has like 75 languages or so. There's a lot of languages. So she grew up speaking 2 or 3 languages. But there's a certain way that when she speaks in English, it has this kind of rhythm that that she forces on the language. That she'll say something like, she'll say a statement and then says, but I don't know, not because she doesn't know, but as it's like a cultural thing where is not so much doubt, but like she's not like the kind of language of the culture is not to force your idea on other people, but to state it and then kind of give a moment for to have feedback. And I've written poetry on with that style of repetition and of ritual, that kind of sense that, like, when I think about growing up, my mom's voice telling me stories that have that certain linguistic repetition that that I feel very strongly about, and I think it reflects not necessarily in this piece. There are moments of repetition, but in my other poetry, I definitely feel that repetition and ritual is super important and vitally linked. And yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Any more thoughts on this one? Anybody want to bounce off any ideas?
Well, it made me think of, Leslie, what you were saying. And well, first of all, Sarah, I love that I don't know, and like how embedded into the language it is to invite reflection. Like, imagine you saw politicians doing that at debates or something. Like, that is, I love the way that different languages operate. I find that so fascinating. Oh, but what I was going to say, Leslie, you were talking about the I will not in that poem. And I'm in this morning reading group, which I mentioned before, led by Ariana Rains. And we just read this text called I Remember by Joe Brainerd. And it ended up being so intense and challenging. But each line begins with I remember. The whole book is I remember this, I remember this. And the reason that it's challenging is that it talks a lot about, like, he was a gay man who died of AIDS, and so he was writing about homosexuality and how, like, he's talking about his own life, but it's absolutely in this detached way. He's just like, I remember people saying this, you know, and that comes up with a lot of things about race as well. And it's like, it's not a racist text, but it is like repeating these words, right? So it acts as this kind of documentation of the time. And we were talking a lot about the like bravery in these I remembers is like showing this thing that you don't even want to remember, right? You don't want it to be, but there's an insistence on the documentation. But that repetition of the I remember for 100 and whatever pages, it really like evokes people to write their own I remembers. Like we were also writing our own, and that invitation to actually write down what you see, right? And we were talking about how one person said in the group, like if time is nonlinear in the way, it's also like a very spiritual group, a lot of spiritual people in there of all different kinds. And so he was saying, if time is nonlinear, it was healing for Joe Brainerd to write this, and it's healing for us to read it. But we are also healing him by reading it retroactively. And I found that really powerful act of like reading and writing backwards and forwards. So hopefully, like as we spoke about with the canon, reclaiming texts can be healing, like things that were not canonized can maybe in some way be healing to like a former culture as well. I don't know, sorry, that was a bit of a ramble.
No, that's really, really fascinating. Particularly just the idea of the repetition of I remember going on for so many pages. Because one thing I've been thinking a lot lately is the use of I statements, or at least even having an I presence in poems at all. Because I've been wondering, and I don't have an answer, but I've been wondering a lot about who is I, and why is that I the authority on what they're talking about? Going back into the canon that we've been discussing, there's big questions about why are you, T.S. Eliot, for example, so important to be saying this. But then, I don't know, sometimes I think maybe I don't want to have any I's in my poems because I want to talk about community and I want to talk about we or you. And I don't want my I to be in the forefront. But then as you were talking about, that I is such a necessary component because it has to come from the individual to say, I remember all of these instances. I remember what you've done to me, in a sense. So I have a lot of big questions about identity and how that relates to community, how that relates to poetics, and how it relates to the concept of ritual. And I don't know. So I guess that goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, about being able to have that I don't know and leaving room for different ideas and different interpretations. Oh, Sarah, you're muted.
I just realized, I was going to say that I realized that the pattern of my mom's conversations when she tells me a story, or when I was growing up, even to this day, she would start off with, I remember, and then after she would say what she remembered, she would say, but I don't know, and then kind of give that reflective moment. And it's that kind of, which is why when you were talking about that poem, it suddenly reminded me of my mom's own speaking pattern of saying, making a statement of, I remember this, but I don't know for sure, or like putting doubt or reflection in the story itself while she's telling it. And yeah, it was one of the reasons why I suddenly remembered my mom telling me stories growing up. And I'm like, yeah, it's because she has that reflective mnemonic remembering moment of, I remember this, but I don't know this. And then as the story goes on, she keeps repeating that. And for me, that's really powerful for writing. I also, like, growing up, I didn't write as much. I mostly was an artist. Like I did visual arts, not like professionally, but just I painted and drew and made sculptures and that sort of thing. And for me, the creative process was always something almost magical. Like I felt like it was almost like an outer body experience. Like I basically in high school, I took as many art classes as I could. And I would have it in the morning, and every morning I'd work on this one giant art project, and it would be a ritual. And I would go to sleep and I'd remember, like, I'd be dreaming about making this art project, like whatever art project I was doing. And it sort of took over any moment that I had, like a down, like I was gonna say a downbeat, like it was music, but like where your mind is working is the upbeat, and the downbeat is kind of like sitting down and relaxing. It would suddenly be the art project that would it would basically take over my life. And it was kind of scary and kind of rewarding as well. I don't do as much art now because it's, for me, it's all consuming, and I feel that I needed like a month just to do that art project because it will literally take over my life. And because it will, like, that ritual of creation is so powerful for me. And yeah, it translates to writing or art or whatever creative process that you do. And it's super powerful.
Just listening to all of you speak, something that I want to put out there, I'm not going to pretend that I have the answers to any of these questions because I absolutely don't. But just think about what you were saying, Leslie, about the I as an authority in a piece. I had a mentor once that said that a you, like the use of a you in a piece, is always an accusation. And I'm wondering if the reverse of that is that if an I might be like an invitation almost to dialogue or something. I don't know. Like, I want to know what you guys think about that, because we never talked about what the I would be. We only talked about the you. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I think that, I mean, I've always seen the you differently. I see the you as a more masked version of the I.
Okay.
So maybe I think that, I don't know, maybe I think that I can very much invite people in. I think that also that's interesting that you could be an accusation. And I guess it could be depending on the voice and on the context, but the way that I've always interpreted it or tried to use it has been a method of masking the self in a way that makes it more safe to talk about the self.
Oh, that's really interesting. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting. Okay, so kind of like decoding the self almost and externalizing it. Mm-hmm. Well, and that goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning about barriers, and using barriers as a healthy way of healing. And I totally agree that they can be. And if there's a poem that maybe you can't write from the I, maybe you can write it from the you. And I don't know, like my mentor said, one of my mentors said that with the you is always an accusation, but I've had the same thing, that the you can be, I don't know, kind of a welcoming thing. And it, like you said, it totally depends on the context and the inflection of the poem and what that looks like. But sometimes the you is just kind of this big hug that brings you into the poem, and invites you into it. So I don't know. Jessica and Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. I think a lot of my piece is written in second person, so
I noticed that.
So and I definitely do. It's something I've noticed. I've written a lot of poetry, and whenever something gets really personal or some slightly traumatic or anything that makes me feel vulnerable, I tend to write in second person, and it's usually to somebody in my life, or it's to myself, I guess, in my past. In this piece, I didn't necessarily wasn't talking to me per se. I was more I just chose the word you instead of I, because I felt, as Leslie was saying, that you is a kind of I. It depends how you write it. In the way that I wrote it, I felt that because I wrote the like they were instructional manuals, like how to build a memory palace, how to I forget, stir a tincture for trauma, something like that. I had a whole series of titles that I wanted them to match in that way. I changed them like 100 times. But in all of those, it was instructional manuals on like using my own experience, almost as though like the magic of what I was explaining was real, and that I was trying to share that healing process with other people as an instructional manual that they could use and say, like, this is what you need to do. If this happens, this is what you can do. Think about where you are when you're trying to do this magic. Are you at home or at school, that sort of thing. And a set of like instructions on how to do it. And I felt like that's what makes this kind of really experimental, because my other poetry doesn't necessarily imagine you as me and me teaching you how to go through situations and apply it in certain ways. But I definitely use the you as instead of I or my name, because I felt like I wanted that experience of, because you can tell a story and a real true experience that's traumatic or difficult for other people to understand because they haven't experienced it. But I felt like to kind of jump that, you can just say you and then talk to them as though they're already experienced, they know exactly what's happening. And that process of experiencing not necessarily the traumatic event, but the repercussions, which I feel like doesn't be like in my piece itself, I don't talk about the traumatic episode that happened to me when I was young, which is that I got chased by police, and it was very traumatic. And I was very young, like 10 years old. And I didn't actually talk about that. I talked about an experience as an adult, seeing a police officer and recognizing the police officer, and him recognizing me, and that moment of like, where does he know me from? And then having like a sort of not necessarily flashback, but a panic moment of what do I do? How do I deal with the situation? And I wanted people to, because talking about the experience itself doesn't really explain the impact it has in the future without you having to jump back and forth and making a much longer story. I felt like having the moment in the future of the event and you feeling it, how it affects people in the future, was more effective to get that feeling across, rather than, oh, this is what happened and you can imagine what the effect was in my life. It was more like, this is the effect and this was a source. And I felt like putting it in the you point of view was like a more powerful version of I.
Yeah, and there's an immediacy to the you as well, and that there's an immediacy and there's the attention grabbing of just like, hey, you, this is important, read this. And if you're okay, Sarah, your subtitles are beautiful, so I'll read them out so everybody can know what they are, if that's okay. So your first one is how to conjure a memory palace, and then you have how to build an invisibility spell, how to lift a curse, and then how to make a tincture for trauma. And the four of these subsections just intersect so beautifully, and they've all got that second person immediacy to them. So it's, I don't know, I feel like your piece is this intersection of so many of the conversations that we're having here about what ritual does. And you've got like self-care rituals and caretaking rituals in here, and taking care of other people. And there's an element of that too, perhaps, with the you, in that sometimes it's easier to take care of other people than it is to take care of ourselves, even if that's a really essential part of our ritual process. So yeah, thank you so much for your answers. Are we okay if I ask you another question? Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit, but are there intersections between rituals and activism for you?
In a way, yes. I feel that with activism, it's an ongoing thing. It's not something that you do once. And someone who has experienced discrimination on many different levels, different experiences with different people, sometimes in power, like teachers, or sometimes people who are like classmates or people, strangers on the street. Like I've experienced it on certain levels. Sometimes it's more subtle, sometimes it's more obvious. But I find that you can't control what happens, but you can control how you deal with how things happen to you. And activism is always trying to change the system that causes the problem, that's giving you this discrimination, this difficulties in navigating society for whatever reason it might be, or a combination, because it's not just one thing, it's a buildup of all these separate parts of yourself that doesn't match what people expect or want from you. And I find that activism is an ongoing process. Like you kind of try to prevent it from happening, but as you're fighting for change, trauma happens, difficulties happen, setbacks happen, and I feel like having a ritualistic moment of kind of dealing with that not just your trauma, because it can be intergenerational. It often is. I'm a child of immigrants, so the trauma that my parents experienced, they're back home in their separate countries, still affect their daily life and me. And it's sort of it's not something that you just deal with once. It's sort of something that it's a continuous process. And I feel like everybody has rituals. Maybe it's not obvious to them on how they deal with it, and it's not necessarily like you can call them coping mechanisms, because they are, but I feel like there's something more powerful with rituals that echo um, your experience that's unique to you, because coping mechanisms they're usually categorized and these are unhealthy, these are healthy. This is like a creative process is sometimes used as a ritual to deal with problems and deal with trauma and as the way to heal. And I feel that that as an like when you're being an activist, you have to be aware that yes, we're trying to change the world and trying to make things better, but you also need to take care of yourself, and sometimes that's taking a break, and sometimes that's doing things that center you and focus you, that so that you can go back or allow someone else to take up the mantle for activism and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I can. Well, Sarah, that was really eloquent, so I don't know how much I have to add to that. Yeah, I don't want to say self-care because it's so commercialized at this point, but it is such an important thing in activism, right? And a lot of the time, because I have like anxiety and, oh, there he is.
He's very welcome.
Oh, he's the best, but he's loud. He'll start meowing in my face. So I have anxiety, which gives me migraines, and so come on then. And so when I've tried to go to protests and things, I have panic attacks and things, and so it's frustrating to not be able to do that kind of like visible, like put your body in the streets kind of activism. And so for me, it's been more about seeing what I can do like online, I guess, and treating that as a public space, but also really living my values in everything that I do, and trying to, and like leading by example, for lack of a better term. I'm not trying to like lead anyone. I'm trying to do my thing. But yeah, like a friend said, I've been vegan for a long time, and a friend who has a food blog, who's quite popular, then became vegan just from seeing me like being vegan and just being chill about it. And so I think there is some ways of possibly doing that activism just by living as well. And of course, I'm not trying to say there isn't, like, direct action is also very important, and I try to do that as well. But yeah, trying to take, for me, I think in this time lately, the ritual has been more like taking time away. So doing the work, whatever that is, like donating money or posting things on social media, or making phone calls and things, but putting that in its bubble. And like, okay, this is the time I'm going to do this, and then this is the time I'm going to like step away. And it's always still a part of you, obviously, but trying to create spaces for that. And then also in my witchcraft, I've been trying to do like healing spells. Like what I've been reading a book lately that the writer Ray Beth, it's called Hedge Witch, so it's for like solitary witches as opposed to in a coven. She talks about the importance in every spell that you do, the rule of 3. So when you are trying to put healing energy, for example, towards something, you put it towards the world, towards someone specific, maybe a friend or someone you know, and then for yourself. But it's so important to like see how interwoven all of those things are and how healing one is healing another. And there is no self without the world, right?
Yeah, Jessica, what you said about living your values really resonates with me. That has such a foundation of authenticity, which is so vital, I think, for any kind of activist lifestyle. I have a really hard time claiming terms like activist or organizer, anything like that, because I don't know that I've earned it. But I do try to just live in authenticity. And part of that just necessarily means living in community and doing my part to contribute to my community and to my people. I saw a tweet recently, and I forgot who tweeted it, but I'm sure it's possible to find. But it just said, I'm not an activist, I'm just a Black person. And I think that's how I feel, because I don't know that it's possible to live authentically as a Black person today without community engagement. I think it's just something we're all doing because it's life. So if that's activism, then okay. But I think the ritual is coming together in community and trying our best to heal each other.
Yeah, no, and I love that as well. And it's about survival too. Like it's healing each other, and it's literally just surviving. Okay. Thank you all for your thoughts on that. Yeah, Jessica, did you want to say something else?
That I always try to remind myself of is like, you can only tidy up your own little corner of the world, right? Because I see things on social media and I'm like, how do I end racism? It's not a thing I can do. So yeah, just like you said, Leslie, like being in your community and living authentically. Yeah, I think is probably the most any of us can probably effectively do. And then if we all do it, that's massive.
Yeah. Okay, so I have some kind of specific questions for each of you. But before we dive into those, I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you wanted to read something from the issue. Like you totally don't have to take me up on this, but if you have like a small section of something that you'd like to read before we go into individual questions, feel free.
Sure, I can read one of the poems. I'll just pull them up. One that I haven't actually read before is A Bloodless Liminal Amber, so I think I'll do that. A bit of context, there's a writer named Will Alexander, Black man who I'd call him an elder in the community at this point, and he's been writing such fascinating experimental work his whole life. And I wrote this poem after my favorite poem of his, which is called Above the Human Nerve Domain.
Oh, Leslie, I think you froze. Can you hear me at all?
A Bloodless Liminal Amber, because that's the last line of his poem.
Also, Leslie, I'm sorry, you froze for a bit.
Oh,
so
no.
I don't think we got to hear your whole preamble.
Okay, well, good, because I just finished the preamble. I hadn't started reading
Okay,
yet.
so sorry.
No, it's all good. All I was saying was that I titled this poem The Last Line of Will Alexander's poem, just because the language was so fascinating to me, and I wanted to see if I could try to recreate something that he does, or the feeling that he creates. So this is A Bloodless Liminal Amber. To undiscover microbial synclines, avalanche the next embankment. To collect the merciless subductions where groundwater is epidermis, as the treasonous west goings. The ensickened grime of majesty misinterprets in gold my undesire. Calloused inside felsic orations, I am learning how to swim. Next, the Milanite faults. I carry islands on my back in top-sweet animosity, in a mock-up of subjugation, fellowing my newly barbaric to the teething of another Nile. This alluvium was never meant to last. Nucleation impels its pieces into viscous dissipating, like forgeries of a future on death. I am new to this poroelasticity. So what concerns me is bedded rock without a politic, a frail and forgetful petrography, the ongoing discontinuity of sunstone. Until this sculpted re-eroding cracks, I do not want to coalesce anymore. Non-volcanic tremors fall inadequate. Here, to disintegrate would be a blessing, to drown something grander. Dripping rheological falsehoods, like the last of our prototypes, like the still forming carbon, I belong to the first of us.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I love that poem. I could read that poem every single day, and I would still find something new every time I read it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Does anyone else want to read a little bit of their work? There's no pressure, but if you wanted to.
I guess I could read some. Let me just open it up. I don't know which one to read though. Okay, I'll read How to Lift a Curse, which is a subtitle for a shorter one. How to Lift a Curse. You found something atypical, a curse that changes as it follows you through the years, like a long shadow exaggerates your every step. To lift it, you must first understand it. It is something that appears at the start of the school year between your teacher's ears, somewhere below their hairlines and above their chins. You find it between that first optimistic day of class and the end of a dreary October. You will notice that it always comes to them as a spell, curse, written on the page that only takes effect once they read IEP. The curse is fickle and changes teachers each a different way. Sometimes it's towards kindness. Often it's confusion. Once it was disbelief and disgust. Every time it masks you from their sight. It colors every question, every silence, and every good mark, good or bad. It is indirect and not meant for them. It bounces off them, through them, and onto you, and it is foul.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And Jessica, I know that your work is predominantly visual in this issue, but is there anything from your essay that you wrote that you'd like to read?
Yeah, I was just looking at it there, and I can read the last couple paragraphs.
Sure.
Look around you now at the stories in which you are awash, the subversive materiality all around us. The sweater, handmade for you with love by your grandmother. The disposable t-shirt made for you by a woman you've never met, working in a dangerous facility, underpaid and becoming sicker from the fumes each day. How much of our world has been made from women and children's labor, their unseen hours hidden in plain sight? There's nothing which is not handmade. The question is, whose hands do we value enough to see? Whose languages do we read? In each moment, each act of creation, the past is either upheld or expressed, expelled. Each daily act of creation is ritualistic, an invitation to heal oneself and others. In reproducing Eliot's canonical work and in writing a knitting pattern, inviting others to further reproduce it, I'm attempting to reclaim our lost histories. To craft is to create, and all forms of creation are intertwined and necessarily spiritual, from spellcraft to knitting. In ritual, we create not only an item, but an energetic space. the potential for our creation to radiate outwards, to recreate, and to reveal. We are art, each of us a creation, and we are remade as often as we remake. We can discover again and again the wild world around us.
Okay, thank you so much, Jessica. And if you haven't already, highly recommend picking up a copy of issue 74 so that you can see Jessica's beautiful photos of her art installation. They're really stunning, so you definitely want to see them. Thank you all three of you for sharing a little bit of your work with us. So what I'd like to do next, I have questions specifically for each of you, but that doesn't mean that you can't answer each other's questions. This is really informal, still a good dialogue. Of just feel free to chime in absolutely whenever you want. So I'll start with Leslie, if that's okay. My question for you is, do you consider engaging with rituals to be an individual endeavor or more of a collective one? And like we said before, these could be like teeny rituals that we don't even notice that we do, or the big ones that we were talking about before.
Yeah, like I was sort of touching on before, I think that a lot of my process that would involve ritual involves healing. So it has to do a lot, and I think it has to start with the individual, which is maybe why my poem sort of took a trajectory from individual into collective. But yeah, I think that at a certain point, it becomes necessary, at least for myself, that community is at the forefront of anything ritualistic, because I am not only myself as a Black person living at the time that I do, in the place that I do. I can't only be a self. I can't envision that. I can't process that as only living an individualistic life. I think that I am a part of a we or an us. So everything I do is about the us. And whether that's, talking about Black communities and everything that we go through, you can come up to another Black person, walk up to them on the street and not know anything about them, but already know a lot of what they've been through because you've seen the same thing. So there's a connection that, whether or not you acknowledge it, will always be present. So whatever actions you do in life are going to have that connection as a foundation. I don't know if this is even about ritual anymore. I'm just talking about living, but I think that life maybe is one big ritual and we're all just walking through it together.
Yeah, I love that. And I think a question that I want to ask you kind of about this idea of living collectively is, does that really directly seep into your poetry practice at all? Like, do you ever do collaborative poetry, like working specifically with other poets? Like we saw a little bit of your work with taking and using these lines from other Black poets to create this collective poem, but do you ever work with like poets that to create something together? Is that part of your practice at all?
It's not something I've done yet, but it is something I definitely want to do. I do have certain practices. There are certain poets that I have a weekly poetry exchange with, where we send each other our poems and we give each other feedback. And that's been one of the most nourishing elements of my life. Getting to share in this deeply intimate process of seeing first drafts of each other's works and getting to give our feedback to each other. It feels so nourishing to get to do that for each other. And there are poets that I would absolutely love to work with, that I think coming together we could create things that are just incredible, and I'm excited to start doing that.
Yeah, and I would absolutely read those in a heartbeat. I would. There's something interesting too, I'm just thinking about, because I have similar groups where you share your first drafts and you're really messy everything, and there's something really generative about that vulnerability, and that's where, for me anyway, and this is me speaking as as a white person of privilege, the majority of my community has come from those, where you learn things about people from their very messy first drafts that you would never get if you only saw the final polished product. So thank you so much for your comments on that. Does anyone else want to chime in and comment on this topic at all?
Yeah, I'd love to say, when we were talking about the I and the you before, I was thinking about the we, because that's been coming up a lot in my writing, in my manuscript that I'm working on right now. It has a lot to do with death and individuality versus collectivity, and like the passing through. But I found that I have to be really careful with the way that I use we, and also in writing about my my knitting projects. There's a lot of like talking about like women and textiles, and I'll use the we, but I found that the we can also be very exclusive, because like if you're not, if I'm saying we in one of my poems, who's the we, right? It's implying that the reader is like me, and that's absolutely there's no guarantee of that, right? So I've had to be more careful with using that, because I thought it would be inclusive, but it wasn't inclusive in the way that I had anticipated. And I'm not saying it's not like that, it's not a collective term, obviously, but it's just become more complicated the more that I've used it and think about it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I don't know, it's tricky because it's these terms that are on the surface inclusive, but there's also so many people that get lost in the we, because it's this blanket statement that can kind of cover over the intricacies of who we are and who's reading and who's writing. So it's interesting to think about, and I'm thinking about the same kind of questions. And again, I have no answers. I'm not going to pretend to. I'm still working through all of this myself. Sarah, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah. I was just thinking my experience in community might be a little different than other people's, because my parents are from, so my mom's African and my dad's Arab. And so the cultures, there are some similarities because they're both Muslim. They grew up Muslim, and there's certain things that are similar because of the rituals and lifestyles that they grew up experiencing, and they brought that over. Well, I guess they individually brought those experiences, and then they met here, and they raised us. And for me, going to communities, either on my father's side or my mother's side, and participating in cultures that are so different, because Ethiopian is very Ethiopian food, culture, dance, clothing is very distinctive. I don't know if you're familiar with Ethiopian food, which is injera mostly, and there's certain things my mom's tribe specifically eats that I truly enjoy, and certain things that my father's side of the family, that's food and culture and dance and clothing, that's very individual to that culture. And for me, when I say we, that word has never really applied to me. Not because I'm like a minority, but because even within my household, my parents would say, "Oh, back home we did this," and my dad would be like, "Oh, back home we did this," and then for me it'd be like, I'm not part of either of those, but I'm part of both. And for me, that experience of it's not necessarily cemented in like Canadian culture of whiteness and non-white. For me, it was more like, oh, this is a shared experience, ancestral thing that I'm technically part of, but because I see myself not as just biracial, but because Canadian influence, it was very strong growing up. My sister played hockey, I ice skated. I love martial arts. There's certain things that completely different than what my parents wanted, or not wanted so much as experienced while they were growing up. And for me, that the word "we" is always interesting to me, because it's not a word I've ever used in poetry. And I guess sometimes in fiction I do use it, and it's always interesting when I read it. I'm like, we, and I always imagine there's a group of people who I'm friends with, and that's what the poem or the story is about. And it, in my mind, it's never, not necessarily excluding, it's more like this is what we do, and I'm kind of sharing what our experience is with you so that you can experience it with us. And it makes that individual voice plural, and it gives that that sense of community that you're sharing with someone. And I like the word we. It's just, for me, it might mean something a little different than to other people because of my own personal history with it.
Yeah, Sarah, I totally relate to that. So my father is an immigrant from Kenya, and I've only been there a couple of times in my life. So there is that yearning and that sense of there is another we that I could technically be a part of, but I don't feel that connection geographically. And as such, we don't have the same cultural connections. And my next big project is going to be centered on that yearning and that concept of a return. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to use the we in that sense, because I think that's a time I'm going to have to engage the I, because I'm going to feel like an outsider to my own community. And I don't know how much of that is geography. I don't know how much of that I'm going to just get into how does the construction of the Earth as a planet create this I versus we, or if there is even a versus, or if it's an I plus, or what that is. But that's something I'm really excited to start exploring.
Yeah, it sounds like such an interesting project. Yeah, I would absolutely love to read it. Okay. So I think, Jessica, I'd love to ask you a question about, I guess I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about the occult in your work, and how you specifically engage with the occult, with rituals. Because we see that really clearly with the Wasteland. And like you said, like you have your candles set up, and it's creating this safe space in which to engage with this. So I guess I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about ritual and the occult, while you hold your lovely cat.
Well, this is Crowley, as in Aleister Crowley, the British occultist. So I swear I accidentally got black cats, and so I just went all in with the names. Yeah, so I've only been practicing witchcraft, it's hard to say when I started. Because I started back when I lived in Toronto. I was like, I'm gonna do a poetry project about witchcraft, and then I'm like, oh no, this is just who I am. And so I haven't actually written about it explicitly. It's just sorry, he's climbing on my back. Thank you. It's just been a part of me developing as a person, and now I think it comes into my art much more so because it is actually integrated into who I am and what I do every day. But it's hard to say how it influences, and especially the occult. I'm still occult meaning unknown, right? Obscured knowledge. I still very much, after 5 years, I still very much feel like a baby witch. So I think I'll be learning my whole life about all of this. But yeah, I think trying to use that ritual and use that meditation to bring my mental state into a place of creativity has become, it's created a much more fulfilling kind of space for me to work in. I think it's much better than what I said before about seeing those separate streams of dream, poetry, magic, and actually seeing them as all one. I find deeply, deeply fulfilling. Caring for myself, creating things for the people I love as a kind of ritual. And also my mindset has really changed around why I create art, in relation to seeing myself as a witch. Because I used to want to, again, when I was in this mindset of the canon and everything, I wanted to win the Griffin Award and be the best at poetry. It made no sense. And now I want to connect with people, right? I want to actually talk to people and have them, or I want to be inspired the way that other people have inspired me. So seeing that connectivity in the world, feel like I'm writing to people, like saying the things I wish I'd heard when I was younger. I think that's like really what I'm trying to do right now. And in terms of ritual, especially during, I put my manuscript aside and I became obsessed with like documenting the moment, which felt very ritualistic. Like you said, Sarah, maybe a coping mechanism, maybe magic. Who's to say what like these labels mean different things, right? Or different labels mean the same thing. So I sort of started two projects. One where I've been creating banners that say things and hanging them off my balcony. So the one that's up right now says, "Come to your body, feel the world grief." And the one before said, "Time isn't real, money is fake." And they're like big banners. And hoping to connect with people that way, right? Trying to step aside from publishing and galleries and things and just like get the art out there into the world. And then also I've been more of a daily ritual. I've started this project. I've been working with cue cards for the last year or so, not really knowing why, just writing things on cue cards. And then when everyone was sort of quarantined at first, like everyone was mainly staying home, I created a like tarot deck or cartomancy deck that was just all of these fragments of words, and I kept adding to it. And then I've been doing tarot readings from these fragments and writing poems from those for each day. And so, yeah, just trying to not create something, or even not even knowing what I'm trying to say, but creating as a kind of ritual of documenting this time. Because we don't know what it is when we're in it, right? So I think the impulse there was to ask spirit, or whatever, that's the term I use, but whatever you call the Godhead, ask them for guidance of like, okay, what do you have to tell me right now? Like I've really approached it as the way that I approach a tarot reading, like asking for guidance. And that's what these poems have become. Yeah. So that's been probably my most directly like mystical, ritualistic writing.
That's so interesting too. And I can only imagine when we're all out of this, looking back on those cue cards and kind of seeing what they tell you, because there's something really generative about that, about having a project and really not knowing what it's going to be or what it needs to be. And then at some point you find out what it needs to be. So I would be really curious to ultimately see what that project turns out to be. And it might just be like a totally personal, I don't know, like coping strategy, or I don't know. It's tricky. I feel like all of our,
I'm definitely going to come back to them, because right now I'm like, I just don't know what they are.
Yeah. And they are what they are right now. And that's good.
Yeah. And then I'll come back and I'll be like, is this a book? If not, whatever. But I think it's just interesting as a documentation of the time, right? I've also been taking pictures of the like playgrounds with warning tape wrapped around them and stuff, you know? We have these double sidewalks in Montreal. Like I just feel like I'm all of a sudden, boom, living in a different world. So just trying to document all of it.
Yeah, and I know for me, all of my creative practices and all of my creative rituals kind of went out the window with COVID, and I'm trying to slowly kind of figure out what those new practices are. And there's an element too, because at the beginning of this, I'm sure you guys saw this, where everyone was like, I'm going to write the next great novel during quarantine, and it'll be brilliant, and it'll be fantastic, and there'll be no challenges. And then there was kind of this slow process of realizing that like, we don't need to be constantly productive during a time like this, and that as much as writing might feel generative and helpful, I'm trying to really just focus on doing it when it's actually going to feel good, and not focus on like, well, I need to come out of this with this many pages written, and I need to publish this many things before COVID is done. because that's the kind of mentality that makes me really anxious, because I feel like I'm not doing enough.
And even
and that joke started
being done.
Yes, exactly. And that's the mentality that I want to carry into this. And that joke started circulating about how Shakespeare wrote King Lear when he was at quarantine with the bubonic plague, and we're all supposed to come out of here having written King Lear, but we're not. If I have written 2 poems by the end of this, I think I will be content.
I know
Leslie, sorry. No, I cut you off. You go right ahead.
The biggest challenge of this time for me has been to just, the phrase that keeps coming to me is "be with," which is also one of the banners that I'm working on, and it's in the tarot deck or the cartomancy deck. The challenge to not be working on something, to be trying to do something with what you're feeling, or whatever it is, like just sit there. Like Sarah, you said sitting on the bus or meditating or whatever it is. Like when I meditate each night, as often as I can. Sometimes I do a kind of like Zen meditation of emptying the mind, and sometimes I just let the thoughts of the day come to me and filter through me, right? Just see what comes up and don't judge it, and just be with that. Is so hard. So hard, but it's I think it's so essential too.
Yes, absolutely. And Sarah, I'm curious too, because your piece kind of intersects with the occult in a different way, in that it's these incantations and these spells. So I'm curious too, because you mentioned that this was part of a longer work. So I'm curious as well about how the occult and ritual kind of work with your writing on pieces outside of this one as well, and your whole kind of poetic practice.
In general, I'm a huge fan of horror stories and monsters, and I was really into like for a long time it was like I think in middle school it was vampire stories, I think, with Dracula, and like stories that were based like had very similar things. I didn't get into Anne Rice until I was much older, but like those kind of vampire stories that have that struggle of a person with their own nature, where they're struggling with the fact that they're a monster. So I really like that darker um, that the story with magic in it, but also that almost human struggle with realizing they're not quite human, they're othered. Might be saying a lot about the kind of representation that I didn't find growing up in books, but it was also it was a struggle that I could understand, because it was a struggle of discovering yourself as not as what you thought, and as a person who has so many different identities, I, as a continuous process of rediscovering myself every few years. And so when I write a story with magic or occult, or because I also sometimes write science fiction, in my fiction pieces at least, I don't take the story as, oh, this is a story that I'm setting in a world with magic, or thing. The struggle that the characters feel is fundamentally like their identity and their worldview, and how they accept the world. All that gets challenged, and I think that has a lot to do with that whole feeling of relating to characters that have that struggle in I don't know, horror books and that sort of thing. I also do like traditional fantasy that has like heroes and quests and that sort of thing. And I also I like reading and writing everything, in all honesty, but with the whole idea with rituals and that sort of thing, I find that because a lot of the chanting that happens in the story or the piece that I wrote, was a lot of it's related to because one of the things that I don't know I took like one anthropology class years ago, and they were talking about how songs and works, like the kind of songs that you do while you're working, while you're weaving or farming or that sort of thing, that a community memorizes so that they can get the work done at a certain pace, and it helps like um, that group dynamic, that spirit of the group, to finish a job and to remember the parts of doing all that, all the parts of a thing. And that those songs were really mnemonic devices, but they also had this kind of effect on the group. And I feel that while I was writing that, I was thinking of the kind of how we sort of, because I hope it might be a bit off topic, but it's one of those things where every time new technology exists, people go up in arms. Like I think now it's video games, and it used to be comic books, and before that it used to be just writing things down. And like you're like, I think it was Socrates was, or someone was saying, oh, you're gonna rot your brains by writing things down because you're not going to remember them. And all these mnemonic devices that we use, because memory palaces come from that era, by the way. um, and like that whole experience of like we've lost, because technology, like writing things down and having books, that writing process kind of removed us from the need to have like these long rhyming poems that are easy to remember because they're rhyming, and stories that repeat certain phrases so that you can remember and find like a lyricist will be able to memorize long pieces of an epic tale because the repetition that keeps going on. I wrote this piece thinking of that magic of memory, that those songs, those chants, those things that for a person who isn't aware, like if we went back in time and saw someone singing these songs, it kind of feels like magic because everybody's in sync, and there's a certain kind of magic that happens with a group of people remembering or singing or dancing to remember a story, to share the past experiences to the new generation. And so for me, a lot of the magic, the ritual, um, I really like the idea of ordinary people experiencing magical moments that feel ordinary sometimes, but also somehow more. And I try to channel that sometimes in almost all my writing, because there's a lot of story. Like one of my biggest issues with epic stories, even though I love them and they're so satisfying to read with the rise and the fall, is that characters are special, and there's no reason why they're special. They're just chosen. There's a prophecy. Something just happens, and they're just special. And I'm like, but I'm like, there is magic in the ordinary, and something magical of not being chosen, of just being. And yeah, that inspires me.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think reading your piece, that magic in the ordinary came through so strong. And this kind of leads into my specific question I wanted to ask you is about walking, and walking as a ritual, because there's so much walking that happens in this piece. So can you tell me a little bit about that, about walking as kind of this meditation practice and how walking and rituals intersect for you?
I don't know what it is about walking. When I was in high school, there was I think one of my learning disability counselors or something like that was talking about different styles of learning and that sort of thing. And I think we decided somewhere between a visual learner and like tactile learner. So like I have to do to learn. And when I write, not necessarily when I write, because I find writing is very similar to thinking. When I think, I tend to pace. I'm the kind of person who will come up with a story while walking back and forth in my house. If I like during quarantine, I have walked my apartment back and forth just because my neighborhood is there's like 3 large buildings and within a really small 4 now. There's 4 large buildings. Sorry, they had construction a couple of years ago, and I completely forgot about it for some reason. But there's like 4 large buildings where I live, and to just leave the apartment and walk, you will bump into people. It's just very crowded, which happens in poor neighborhoods. They keep building and building despite the lack of space. But for me, walking is how I think, and I I wrote some of it in in the piece that I wrote for this, and I talk about walking. So I talk about walking all the way to school, and I in Toronto, when you go to high school, you get to choose what high school you go to depending on the programs that they have. I chose to go like an art school that had like an arts program and drama program that was really good, and rather than going to the school that was closest or the school that had academic programs that were really good, because that wasn't something I was concerned with when I was 13. I was more interested in being able to draw and get marks for that. And so I chose to go to a school that was kind of far. It was quite far actually. And I decided to start walking to school. And in my mind, I was like, well, if I'm late, I can always just take a shortcut to a main road and then take the bus the rest of the way. I didn't do this to save money. I didn't do this for exercise. I did this yes, I did save money and I did get a good amount of exercise, but it was the reason why I did it was that there was something about being able to walk with my own feet, that I was able to kind of have that meditative moment on that bus that I was talking about earlier, but bigger. While walking, I get to think and reflect and just kind of be in my own body and sometimes escape in my own mind. And walking to me has always been really powerful. I guess maybe I am a tactile learner and I physically learn that way and understand the world through movement and physicality of things. I'm really good at directions. So there are certain things that lead to the idea that I need to physically be active in doing things. And so for me, walking isn't like a physical activity, it's a mental one, and spiritual and emotional. And I have walked an insane amount of distances, well, I've been really far away from home and I'd be like, oh, I'll walk home, or I'll walk to this intersection, and then I just end up taking 2.5 hours and walking home from quite far away places. And then I'll tell my parents, I'm like, why? And they'll be so confused. Like, you can take the bus and you have a bus pass. Like, you're not saving money by doing this. And I'm like, no, it's just, something that I need to, like, it was hard to explain when I was like 17 and 15 why it was so important to do this walking experience. It yeah it had a combination of feeling accomplished once you've done it, but more than that, there was something about walking that lets you meditate, because you don't have to think about it. It's just an automatic thing. And yeah.
That's so fascinating. Thank you, Sarah. Leslie and Jessica, do either of you have like physical components to your creative practice like that?
I also love walking, and I'll walk like an hour and a half. Probably I wouldn't walk somewhere if it's more than an hour and a half walking, but like, yeah, I'll happily walk somewhere or walk home. And I love it. You just get to reflect. Exactly. But yeah, when I'm stuck on something, usually in writing, I'll go for a walk, and it just loosens things up in there. I don't know what it is, but I can always figure something out in my writing if I go for a walk. It's amazing. It makes me think I should do more of it. Now I'm all inspired from hearing Sarah talk about walking. I also love, I'm like a little raccoon, and I love garbage. And so one of my favorite things is tonight, actually, going out. Tomorrow's garbage day, so everyone will have put their stuff out. And at night, I'll go just walk up and down the streets in my neighborhood and pick up trash. Pick up things I don't think are trash, but someone threw out. Yeah, night walks especially, I love.
That's awesome. How about you, Leslie?
I don't know that my practice with walking is as consistent or as directly related to my creative process as Jessica and Sarah, but one thing I do love to do is when there's something big and important that I am having trouble processing, I will go for a walk, start recording a voice memo, and just talk. And I have so many, like 20 to 60-minute long voice memos that no one's ever going to hear, that just are the way that I can figure out my thought process and figure out how I feel, because sometimes things are just too big to sit and think about them or even walk and think. I have to be speaking and feel like I'm engaging with my body, with my supposed audience that isn't actually in existence. I'm not going to share these with anyone, but to feel like I am speaking something into the world is such a powerful way for me to understand my own feelings. So I think that it can be quite generative. I'm sure it is, that some of these things that I talk about end up in poems, or the way that I understand emotion or I understand any sort of event from this work that I've done in walking and speaking. I'm sure it makes its way into my poems, but it's not a method I use directly to write. But I think that it's a method of sustaining my personhood, which I guess necessarily then translates into my writing.
Do you ever go back and listen to them?
I recently did go back and listen to a lot of them, and some of them were quite ridiculous, and some of them were surprisingly deep. There's a lot that I don't remember saying, but it's in there and I did it. And maybe one day I will go and transcribe them all and see what I can cull from them and piece together into poems. But maybe some of it is work that's just for me, that isn't meant to be shared. I don't know. But we'll see. Maybe 60 years down the line I'll have something to do with them.
Yeah, the collected recordings of Leslie Joy Ahenda. It'll be excellent. Okay, well, before we wrap up, those are all the questions that I have for you folks. Is there anything that we didn't talk about, or any lingering thoughts that we want to bounce off of each other?
I'd love to speak to what Leslie just said about speaking. It's something I've been thinking about for the last year or so. So in my own spiritual practice, because there's a lot of speaking out loud in witchcraft. I think also specifically because it's traditionally done in a coven, in a group, right? But that just didn't really feel, I don't know, it didn't resonate with me. I think especially because I came from a background of Zen Buddhism, which was just sitting quietly, right, and moving around the energy in your body. But about a year ago, I was at the Banff Center, and I spent a lot of time speaking to different Indigenous people there, especially Blackfoot people who actually who are from that land, and learning Blackfoot words for the different beings, like the different trees and mountain. And I would speak to them, like I would say hello mountain in the Blackfoot language every morning when I would see the mountain. And I was thinking a lot more about the importance of actually speaking out loud as calling into being. I don't know, it's something I'm still thinking through and working through. I love reading my work out loud. Like I love doing readings, and I feel like my ideal way for someone to encounter my poetry is not on the page, but me reading it to them. So yeah, there is something deeply important about speaking out loud. And Leslie, I do the same thing, where if I'm really all bottled up, I'll start speaking out loud like a crazy person. But it's so helpful. It really is helpful. It's an expulsion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because there's something so important about externalizing and just separating something from yourself. And I personally haven't done that with speaking out loud. Maybe I should try that. But I just kind of write these long, rambling, written monologues, I guess, for lack of a better word. But maybe I need to try speaking them out loud. Maybe that's all part of the same process. That would be really generative. Before I pass you back to Kyle to wrap up, I just want to say thank you so much to the three of you. First off, for the incredible creative work that you produced and that you shared with us. Thank you for your thoughts and your conversations tonight and your openness to talking about some personal things, because rituals, like we said at the beginning, are inherently personal. But it feels very special to have had this conversation with the three of you. I think we've learned a lot about each other, and I'm so thankful for this. So thank you very much for both your written words and your spoken words.
I'm going to jump back in now. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted? Wonderful. Okay, great. I also want to say thank you. You've given me an immense amount to think about. There's a lot of, you brought a lot of like really deeply considered things to the table here. And I really had the urge to like jump in every couple seconds, but obviously don't want to interrupt like such a wonderful conversation you guys were having. And thank you again. At the end here, all I really need to say is thanks to our panelists and also Amy for helping me put this together. And also thank you to the audience members for tuning in on our live stream. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first time we've tried anything like this. And I think this is great. I've had a lot of fun. I apologize about the camera mix-up at the beginning. I don't think that persisted throughout. So fingers crossed. To our audience members, if you are interested in purchasing a copy of Filling Station issue 74, you can do so. There's a link in the event description below. You can also subscribe to Filling Station through the same link, and you can get it at Shelf Life Books here in Calgary. There's a link to their online store in the description as well. They also have many copies of Amy's book, I Know Something You Don't Know, and we have one remaining copy. I just went and found it during the event of Jessica's K2TOG, in which there are many of the patterns you can actually knit yourself one of these wonderful poems. So yeah, get a hold of Shelf Life. You can place your orders online, you can do it on the phone, all that good stuff. On behalf of both Filling Station and Shelf Life, I just want to, one more round of thanks for everybody, and my name is Kyle. Thanks again for joining us, and we didn't really get any questions in the live chat, but there's, I know that our panelists can't see the live chat, but there's a ton of great comments in there, so afterwards you'll have to go over to the YouTube page and see all the wonderful things people were saying about you, and yeah, thanks again. It's been a wonderful night, and from Shelf Life Books, I'm